Hey everybody, I'm Bill Calkins with Ball Tech On Demand, and I'm excited to kick off an entire month of short educational sessions intended to help you get prepared to grow your best crops ever to send to market next spring. I like to say that fall is spring training for our industry, the time to get your operation tuned up for high-end production. We've selected 9 topics to cover this month, one for each Tuesday and Thursday, and hope you'll take some time each day to grab your phone, a tablet, your computer, and head to the break room or your office with a bite to eat and hear from Ball Tech On Demand experts who truly want to increase your knowledge and rate of success. So let's go ahead and meet today's presenters. Our first guest is Dr. Will Healy, the Senior Technical Manager at Ball and a man with a wealth of experience working with greenhouse professionals around the world. Will's a problem solver extraordinaire, and if you have a greenhouse challenge, he's probably encountered it before. His wit and wisdom is known throughout the industry. So, Will, welcome. And what are you hearing from growers as they prepare for spring 2021?
Well, thanks, Bill. I think people are gearing up all over the place. We hear from Australia that they're having outstanding spring season. Of course, their spring is just getting started. So if that is any indication of what we should be expecting, I would be really looking for even a better spring than last year, which was truly an outstanding spring season. So now's the time to really start gearing ourselves up and getting on track.
Excellent. And next, our second guest is Dr. Todd Cavins, who's also spent a lot of time in greenhouses as a technical manager with Ball. Before that, he was a professor and also a product manager for other products, and he's helped train growers to achieve success and tackle a wide range of challenges. He holds tremendous knowledge and experience, and the folks he's worked with always appreciate his real world approach and understanding of the realities that growers face on a daily basis. Todd, any thoughts on how 2020 is wrapping up and what growers should be doing to get ready for 2021?
Yeah, I'll echo what Will just said. A lot of customers are reporting it was a really good year. Crazy year, pandemic year, lots of changes. But we did have a couple of reminders that, we've got to sharpen our skills a little bit. There were some disease issues out there in a few crops. There's always something out there. So that's really what we want to do. I think your analogy of spring training is great. Let's start right now and let's get this season off to a great start.
Awesome. That sounds good. I think since time is short and the audience is probably finishing up their sandwiches now and moving on to dessert, let's get going. But real quick before we jump right into the topic, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. All the videos and webinars from this October series are going to be collected and posted at growertalks.com /tech on demand for future viewing or to share with the rest of your team. So we will include the links in the video description. They're right here on the screen. And if you have any questions as we move through the presentation, post them in the Q&A section. Our panelists might see your question and answer them on the fly, but more likely I'm going to jump back in at the end and do my best to ask all the questions that you post. So Will, why don't you go ahead and share your screen and take it away, and I'll be back in a bit to get through any questions from the audience.
Great. Well, this is always probably one of the biggest challenges is when do you start planning and when do you start retraining everyone? And now is the time as we kind of move out of poinsettia season and mum season is over and now really start thinking strongly about vegetative production. And, this is going to be a really fast-paced presentation. We've got a lot of things to think about because there is a lot of things to think about as we go into the season. So let's go ahead and get started, Todd, with probably the single most important factor of how do you be successful with this program?
Absolutely. Yeah. And the first thing we're talking about vegetative propagation today, and it's sanitation. For those of you who are at the computer right now, can see the screen, we're showing a shot here with some algae growth on the floor. We've got debris on the bench. This is a recipe for disaster right here. And so we want to get cleaned up. If you've got fall crops in the house right now, moving them out, shipping mums, poinsettias, now's the time to get cleaning and then clean again before those crops get there. We're not just talking about cleaning the benches as either, anything those plants may touch. So we're talking about carts, the benches, clean up the floor, clean up the debris. That is going to be key. One of the things we've found over the recent years is we've really started to help monitor and work with growers on a sanitation program is not only did we reduce disease, but we really reduced insect and arthropod pest problems. So, sanitation, it's very beneficial in many aspects. So another thing to prep, before the plants get here, before any, with the orders start rolling in or anything like that, we also need to think about being prepared from a nutritional standpoint, which is one of my favorite things to talk about. But, right now is a good time to test your water. If you've got soil coming in the near future, let's get a test on it before it gets ready. The reason this is so incredible, and we'll talk about this here over the next few minutes, is I'm going to share some tips and techniques on fertilizer choice that can help you with growing your crop in propagation. But some of those fertilizers may not work depending on your water quality. So let's get it tested now. Let's make sure we know where it is. Let's get those treatments going, such as acid injection, that may allow us to use these fertilizers as better tools to help our tone growth. Okay, let's also get prepared, and let's talk about receiving cuttings. Okay, they're going to be coming in soon. What I like to say is let's inspect and protect. Okay, be prepared when your cuttings arrive. Know who your courier is, what day they're coming in. Be prepared to put them in a protected area, a cooler if you have them. But before you do that, open them up, inspect them, and let's take a look at the health of those particular URCs that are coming in. And one of those aspects you want to talk about is temperature, Will. So share with me a little bit, and our friends here, what is it about temperature that we need to do?
Yeah, one of the areas that we've spent a lot of time working on is can you predict performance before you ever stick the cutting? Because sticking a cutting that's going to die really is not very satisfying, to say the least. So what we really have found over the years is that you really need to have an infrared thermometer. And one of the maybe byproducts of COVID is everyone's got one now. If not, buy one. They're not that expensive. And they're really valuable, because what we want to do is we want to do the 3-point check. Check, first of all, what is the ice temperature? Is it ice or is it just warm water? That's a very good clue that you could have a problem. Check those cuttings that are next to the ice, because if they're frozen, you got a problem. If they're hot, you got a problem. And then check the cutting along the edge of the box so that you kind of understand what was the impact of where it was shipped. Sometimes what we see is that in that early spring season is that you may find that the edge is frozen, but the middle is okay. Now, word of caution, don't go and hold up the bag and basically try to measure the infrared through the plastic. That doesn't work. You've got to basically open the bag and actually shoot the stem, because the stem is basically what's holding the temperature the most and give you the most accurate measurement. So if you just measure the bag, you're just measuring the bag. What you need to do is measure the stem temperature of that cutting, and that's a really good indicator of what is going on. Next, you want to do a hydration check when you've got those bags out. And a hydration check is really very complicated, isn't it, Todd? You grab the end of the cutting, and if it basically hangs like a dead fish, well, that's a cutting that has lost turgidity. If it looks like a bird so that the leaves are basically held out, that's a turgid cutting. That cutting is full of water. Why is that important? Well, what we know is that turgid cuttings root faster, root more uniformly, and you have less death. When you basically stick those limp cuttings, what that usually means is that the first thing you gotta do is rehydrate them. Then once they're hydrated, if they haven't died yet, then you have to go and try to get them to start callusing and rooting. You delay the process. Have you ever seen that uneven rooting that you see? That's all about that they basically dried out. So let's take a look at make sure that they are hydrated. Just grab the end of a couple cuttings and make sure that they're not like this, but they're like this. The next thing you want to do is really get yourself organized. Let's get those kits put together. In this case, this is an ideal situation. Notice how it's a little foggy in that cooler. A high humidity cooler is a great place to store your cuttings and hold your cuttings in their kits so that they will rehydrate. They'll take up that moisture, because you can hydrate limp cuttings in a cooler that's at about 50 degrees and 99% relative humidity. It should be foggy in there. That's ideal. You can take them out of the bag, out of the boxes, very important. Get them into these different kits. And a kit basically is these cuttings get stuck with these labels in this tray. Get yourself organized before you ever try to stick, so that that's where all the organization occurred. Get your unrooted cutting, your label, and what group is it? Where should it go so that it can be put away in the greenhouse? So let's talk about some of the things to consider, Todd. What about rooting hormones? Would you use those?
Yeah, there are a lot of crops that are, get very good benefits from using rooting hormones. We're going to talk about in just a moment rooting hormones out in the greenhouse, but there's a lot of plants that respond well to rooting hormones that are dipped or powdered on. So, figure out what you need, contact your breeder reps, find out if they are recommending those or not. If you're doing a lot of perennial crops, most of those need or benefit from rooting hormones more so than some of the annuals, and they tend to need a little bit higher concentration. So do your homework now, get the appropriate rooting hormone in, and think about sanitation when applying those hormones. We don't want to use the same powder or dipping solution over and over and over for days and days and days. We could create a bacterial soup in there, a disease problem, and we just don't want to do that. So yes, get rooting hormones. They are very beneficial in helping a lot of crops root uniformly. Okay, another thing to think about, sticking efficiencies. There's a lot of talk out there about lean flow techniques and things like that. And some of those work great for you and some may not, but let's think about just making sure we have all of our things, lined up and ready to go. Do we have the trays? Do we have the soil? Do we have it organized in a manner that when I pull my cuttings out of the cooler where I had them nice and hydrated in there, that they're sitting there just the appropriate amount of time and that they aren't sitting there getting dehydrated or too hot or in an area that they may get too cold. So let's get prepared and think about a very efficient process from removal of the URC out of the cooler to the sticking process. How many people do you need for the amount of URCs you have that day? And then, getting them out to the greenhouse. But I think one of the important things to think about is the soil moisture while we're sticking that. So, Will, what are your recommendations for how wet should the soil be?
Okay, so if you're used to the 5 levels of moisture, and if you're not, we do have some various webinars available to do the training, and there'll be a talk later this month on water and watering, training your group to water. But you want to basically set a target. You want to be at about a level 3 on that tray at the time of sticking, because if you've got dry cells, that's not good for callus, because callus is a warm, wet process, warm and wet. So you want to make sure that it's warm. It's not saturated, it's wet. So it'd be about a level 3, maybe a level 4 is very important. And many times if you're using an Elipot or a stabilized medium like a glue plug, and you basically aren't checking the middle of the plug, what happens, the edges are wet, but the center is bone dry, and you wonder why they're not rooting. It's not because it might be warm, but it's not wet. So you really want to make sure that that warm, wet. And then also make sure that you close the dibble. You get the soil on the stem. And one of the best ways is to take your water tunnel and just give it a slight 45-degree turn, as in the picture where you have one water bar watering straight down, the next one coming in at a 45-degree angle or forward, the next one coming at a 45-degree angle from backwards. So you kind of push that water in and around the soil so you nest it. Very important with Calibrachoa, very important with some other crops, because if you don't close the hole, you're going to have a problem. And then also looking at how long is it taking from the time that you stuck it until it actually gets out on the bench. What our research has shown is that you can take a fully hydrated cutting and you can dry it out in an hour or less, depending upon how humid your area is. If you have to hold them in a fog area within your greenhouse. So let's talk a little bit about getting them laid down. What should you be doing, Todd?
Well, you mentioned at the start of this when we were sorting cuttings in the cooler and organizing them and getting them in the right spot. Well, we've got to do that, continue that process out to the greenhouse. In vegetative propagation, one of the things we often think about is what misting group does this crop need to be in. So separate that depending on what your system is in your greenhouse. We really like the VPD systems we see at a lot of the rooting stations. Those allow you some precise control. They allow you to break your greenhouse up into zones. Those are very nice, but think about that. You know, maybe a bracteantha doesn't need to be right next to a geranium. So different crops require different misting. Let's think about your lights up ahead. Are you in a northern area where you have to have some high intensity lighting or LED lighting? You know, what crops need that? How is that? Are you affecting your photo period, and how are you affecting that? So some crops absolutely like a little bit of long days and propagations, and some don't. You know, what other things? Temperature, you know, most of us maybe not be able to have too many temperature zones in our greenhouses, but you know, there definitely are some of those crops that they just are not going to root if you can't get that soil temperature up around the 70-degree mark. So think about that, your layout plan, have that figured out before we move out into the greenhouse. Moving plants after we've put them down on the bench or the floor, that's a very costly operation. So think about that. And then let's think about rehydration. Okay, rehydration on the bench. You've talked about how critical it is to make sure we stick a turgid cutting. Well, this next 24 hours as we move out into the greenhouse is another critical period for that. So first 24 hours. Oh, well, here's a great picture before we move on. Moving plants out to the greenhouse. If you don't close in that dibble hole like Will was talking about, you can see this Lizomachia for those at your computers today just bounced right out. So get them cleared out, and let's have an organized plan to get them out to the greenhouse nice and gently. So let's move on to the next slide, Will, and talk a little bit more about hydration and turgidity, okay? The mist program. The first 24 hours, what our mind is gearing towards is rehydrating that cutting. You know, we wanted to stick nice and turgid, but that first 24 hours, we have a little bit higher mist program going. Again, if you have a VPD system, this is an excellent tool to do this. If you just have a timer system, you know, maybe that first 24 hours, you have a little bit more frequency of your mist, and then we start to back that off and after the first 24 hours, okay? So let's think about that mist program. What is the goal of that? Our goal is not to make the plants wet, not to make the soil wet. We are trying to stop water loss from that URC cutting, right? It doesn't have any roots on it yet. It doesn't have any way really to effectively take up water. So our mist program is all about stopping transpiration or slowing transpiration so that the cutting or the URC does not dehydrate. So those are some things to think about with mist. Will, what are some of the things you think about when you talk about you have moist foliage? What are we looking for there?
Okay, because really think about, you know, are you wilted? Because remember, every time you go through a wilt cycle in a 24-hour period, you're pushing the rooting process out at least 2 to 3 days and delaying it. So what the goal is, within that 48 hours, you want those leaves up, and you want them to be happy cuttings. Now they might go down a little bit, but you don't want them to do a really severe wilt. How do you manage this? What's the technique? One is think of the area you're in. If you're in starting the mist system and you're starting to fill a greenhouse, you got this huge greenhouse that's all dry, you got floors that are drying. Make sure that you're misting the dry areas, the empty greenhouse, to raise the humidity in that greenhouse. 80% relative humidity is the place you want to be, because that will help your mist system maintain moisture on the foliage. If you're running 40% humidity, if you're running 50% humidity in the environment, that's going to suck water out of those cuttings and out of the trays. Make sure that you're basically putting on enough water, because remember, you've got the frequency, which is when it comes on, and then you've got the duration, how long it's on. Two very important factors to consider. And how do you manage that? Because people say, well, did I miss enough? Did I not miss enough? Well, again, water by weight. This is the technique where you basically go out and weigh some trays. What you're looking for is if you set in your water tunnel that you've set, let's just say, give it a number, you've set 1,400 grams as coming off the end of the mist line, the sticking line, and then you set it down. You want that water moisture because you know that that's ideal. You may want it to be 1,500, 1,600. You don't want it 2,500. 2,500 grams tells you that your on cycle may be too long. You're misting too much, because once that soil gets saturated, it's really hard to dry it back out. So the foliage wet, but the soil not saturated. But what are some other things, Todd, that we can do here to basically improve our rooting?
Yeah, we did some research over the past few years looking at just different ways to enhance it. And we'd seen some information out there in the trade journal articles about applying products such as Paget fungicide that helps to boost rooting. Got some information recently from the folks at Syngenta that says their product Mural, which they're similar products for you folks in Canada, that'd be Pristine, which is Paget's equivalent up there. They're the 7+11 of the mode of action fungicide codes. They actually do improve rooting. We applied those soon after sticking at very low label rates. We didn't see the results initially, but later in the rooting process, say like in week 2, we did see enhanced rooting from these. I mentioned rooting hormones earlier. K-IBA, that's potassium IBA. IBA is a rooting hormone. This is a water soluble one. If you haven't gotten samples of this and practiced and tried it, you may want to do this. This is a very efficient mean to put rooting hormone on after you stick out in the greenhouse. You can essentially spray, or what we have found is at a little bit lower rate than what you might find in some of the literature at a higher application volume. So a sprench versus a spray at a little bit lower, so say like 100 parts per million, is we found very successful with a lot of vegetative annuals.
Okay, so when you talk about callus, callus is basically what it does is, your stem is like this. It's very tight cells. What callus does is it basically opens up the cells so the roots can then penetrate through those cells coming from the vascular bundle inside. That's the technical way of doing it. So the purpose of the callus is you want to swell that. You don't want this big chunky callus because then it's just even more for the root to come through, but you want it to swell. And that's what, as Todd said, the K-IBA, basically you get it warm and moist and you basically get the swelling. But even though we got it swelling, we got the roots starting to move within the stem, but all of a sudden, Todd, the plants start becoming chlorotic. What do we do?
Yeah, so I mean, a URC, we've taken that plant and removed it from its nutrient source, which is the mother plant. So even in propagation in mist before rooting, we still need to do some feed applications. The misting process, it leaches nutrients out of the plant and it leaches nutrients out of the soil. So we need to think about getting some feed on at this time. Some growers like to do that in the mist water themselves. Some just like to come back in with a hose and a portable injector and go over the top. But nutrition is important here. We've got to have those nutrients there so the plant can continue to grow and build the root structure to get out. Of course, once the plant starts growing and in the environment of propagation, warm, wet, so a lot of times low light, perfect recipe for stretch. So we've got to be thinking about a plant growth regulator application as well. And these are very light applications. Even if you go and do something like the Grower Talks plant growth regulator guide, there's some rates in there, but you want to go to the low side of the rates and even maybe reduce those by 1/3 to 1/2 if you're in propagation. And volume is key on these. A heavy application is a lot more potent than a light application. It's a lot of trial and error on this one, but PGRs are something that you do have to work on in your own environment to make them successful.
And one of the big problems that we run into is, of course, the monitoring for insect and diseases. Now is the time, especially with unrooted cuttings. Sometimes they have some insects that hitchhike in. So make sure you get out there and start your monitoring program. And of course, the most important place to monitor in a propagation area is under the bench, because that's where the fungus gnats and shoreflies are. If you didn't follow Todd's sanitation program and treated this under the bench, guess what? They're going to come up out of the ground, and then that's where they're coming from, and then they dance over your plants, and off you go. But let's now start speeding up, because that's what's happening to the crop. They need to start growing. And of course, what's the first stage 3? It's basically getting those roots and getting that shoot growth. And one of the most important thing to remember is we're growing roots, and that fish grow in water, roots grow in air. This is water by weight, making sure you've got your scale out there and you're weighing your trays to see, is my weight below saturation? Am I at a level 4 moisture or less? Am I starting to dry them out just a touch in the soil to basically get those roots to penetrate that soil and get them moving? Because you need the roots, because, Todd, what do you want to be doing at this point?
Hey, we're taking up nutrients as well as water. So let's move on to nutrition. So I mentioned that just a few moments ago, but when we have roots, we need to apply the nutrition so plants can grow and grow effectively. You've got to have your macronutrients, your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, as we have listed here on the screen. Do you have to have a lot? No. If you're using a complete feed, most propagators are using somewhere in the neighborhood of 50, 75, maybe even up to 100 parts per million, so for very aggressive crops. But the point is get feed. Okay. Another very important aspect of a lot of vegetative annuals is they tend to need a fair amount of micronutrients. Okay. And we've seen some growers that are, become a little too reliant on the iron chelate products, and we're seeing a little bit of balance problems with iron and manganese. So those iron chelates are very beneficial tools. Make sure you're not overusing that and getting the iron and manganese out of balance. The textbooks often say 2-to-1 ratio. We're finding that a little closer to 1-to-1 is actually performing a little better for a lot of these vegetative crops. But if you're a grower that's applying iron chelate week after week after week, you may see it, you're like 5-to-1. And that actually makes the plants look just like you're trying to avoid. It makes them look iron deficient. The manganese deficiency looks quite similar. So keep that in mind. You may want to use a balanced micronutrient approach. Okay. Calcium and boron is something else that's really important in propagation, because we're trying to slow that transpiration initially. That slows or stops calcium and boron uptake. So make sure that you're using a feed or have a sufficient calcium in your program. Okay, that may mean you need to move to a CalMag fertilizer, which is great because they have high nitrate nitrogen that keeps plants nice and toned. Don't have to rely on the PGRs as much, but they tend to have a little bit lower micronutrients. And so things like your iron and manganese may be a little too low, and especially your boron may be too low. So, it can get a little complicated, but the take home message here is, let's go ahead and apply the nutrients and build the micronutrient program off of that. You may even want to separate it. A lot of growers at rooting stations have gone to where they're doing the macros in one tank and the micros in another, so that they can control growth with lower macronutrients but still provide sufficient micronutrients.
Yeah. And of course, one of the objectives here in our rooting process is not only to get roots, but also to start the branching. And so feed is important. Get those roots so that you can put the fertilizer, so that the roots will now take up the fertilizer. So that first two things, get the roots, get the feed, and let's promote branching, because that's a key part of it. And of course, one of the things that will promote branching, especially in the northern tundra areas, is the DLI, getting the more light. The more light you can put on them, the better. And also think about photoperiod. We're going to talk a little bit about some tricks for photoperiod later this month, and some of the different things. But these are long day plants. These plants are flowering during the summer, so therefore they need long days to get them flowering, keep them flowering, because one of the worst things you do is shift them back into short days where they go vegetative, and they might get big and vegetative, but they're sure not going to hit those early flowering dates, which we're looking for. So let's make sure that we get out there and get the light on them, light intensity, and on the photoperiod. But let's keep them also in control. Todd, what about growth regulators?
Yeah, I mean, with extra light, we're going to get extra growth, but if we have the right intensity of light, they're going to be nice and toned. But plant growth regulators are, again, going to be an effective tool at this time in the propagation. But let's also think about, as I mentioned, light is important here because we can apply it again. We can't take it away. So light applications of plant growth regulator. But now we also need to think about other things. We're coming to the time where we may need to pinch a certain species. So how is that plant growth regulator going to affect that? We don't want to do it too heavy, too early, where we don't have enough plant structure to pinch off that promotes branching. We also don't want to apply it so heavily that we start to limit growth and limit the grow out after we transplant it. So again, light with the PGR, monitor insects and mites. This is critical throughout this entire crop. You need to be monitoring. These farms that we work with here, they do a great job, for the most part with pest and disease problems, but it's inevitable. If you're in the greenhouse industry, you're going to have to deal with this. Think about a soil and tissue fungicide program, so we protect both the roots and what's below the soil, as well as the foliage up on top, using broad spectrum type products or tank mix type products. Also think about using a lot of the softer chemicals, the microbial antifungal agents that are out there, and anti-pest agents that are out there. We're seeing a lot of success with those microbial products in propagation. And again, we talked about nutrition, monitoring your soil and water before we get started. Hey, we've been out there a couple of weeks. We've been applying a lot of things to the soil. The plants are starting to take up nutrients. Things are changing. Let's monitor the soil pH and EC at this time as well.
Yeah, because, as we begin to transition the plants, preparing them for transplant, we really need to be starting to think about what are we doing? Do we have enough feed in those plugs so that they're ready to take off and grow? Are we basically getting enough light, and are we starting to cool them down, tone them down, prepare them to move them from the rooting area into our final production area? Start thinking about what is your toning strategy? What is your toning process? How are you going to have a plant that's going to be really ready to go and take off once it's in its final container? One of the key problems that we see time and again is where people aren't prepared, they didn't plan ahead, and they didn't plant on schedule. This year, I think a lot of folks realize that you got to get them on schedules, you got to be on time, because when the market opens, we got to be ready to go. And there's nothing worse than watching a bunch of green plants sit there and realize you could have sold them if you only had them in bloom. And you could have only had them in bloom if you would have planted them on time. So let's make sure that we're getting everything on time and keeping it on time. Make sure that you're shearing those plants that need to be sheared to get the branching, and get it done early enough so that you got time to grow out and flush out and get good solid flowering on them. So what else can we do, Todd, to make sure we've got good quality liners to finish?
Yeah, again, let's just talk about those tools, PGR to tone, which we've mentioned several times. Light application, not trying to stop growth, just trying to minimize the stretch for the most part, because we still want to promote that branching, just like we can get with the pinching there as well. Let's also talk about transplanting them to our final containers and grow out. One of the great tools we can use to get excellent grow out is to actually fertilize that liner right before we transplant it. This is where we like to move away from the CalMag fertilizers for a couple of irrigations, even if your water quality, kind of indicates that's what you should be using, because a product such as 20-10-20 has a little bit more ammoniacal nitrogen. That's the nitrogen that's going to give you a little bit softer growth, a little more lush growth. You're going to get a burst of growth, and you're going to have that liner, the blood plug or liner, really charged up when you put it into the larger container of soil. Fertilizing all that extra soil around in the finished container can be a little wasteful, and the roots aren't there yet. So fertilize the liner before you transplant it. Okay, when you do transplant that, just like the URC, we want good soil contact with that liner and that root ball. That's going to be critical for getting those roots to move out. And when we irrigate, we don't want to just kind of baby irrigation, just lightly touch it. We want to irrigate all the way through to encourage that contact and to eventually encourage those roots to go down to the bottom of the container so we get uniform root distribution. Those light irrigations aren't good, because then we just get roots at the top, and that's a recipe for disaster. Can affect our irrigation strategy down the road as well.
So we've talked about a number of things over the last half hour, but let's just hit on the 6 key points that we've seen over the years that basically will give you uniform performance and the ultimate success. Number 1, hydrated, unrooted cuttings. Time and again, we've got problems on uniform rooting, poor yields, poor everything, even at all the way to retail. And it really goes back to, did you have hydrated or dried out cuttings at the time that you stuck them? So really focus on that if you're going to focus on anything. Remember, think about how fast can you callus, because the longer it takes to callus, the more likely the plants are going to die. So make sure that you've got warm and wet, not warm and soaking wet, but warm and wet. And you get the growth regulator on, the rooting hormone on, you get everything ready to go. And then once you've got that callus, now let's start managing the moisture to maximize root growth, because fish grow in water, roots grow in air. And let's make sure that we keep a lot of air going in there to get all of that. So what else can you do, Todd?
All right, here I sound like a broken record, but let's think about PGRs. They're a very effective tool here. Let's also talk about the nutrition, okay? The nitrogen and phosphorus. One of the things I do want to mention is there's been this discussion in the industry for years about low phosphorus controlled stretch. That's true to a point, but that's really a narrow window to get low phosphorus to control stretch without going deficient. So I would encourage you, give an ample amount of phosphorus in this propagation. I like 5 to 10 parts per million of phosphorus in the soil. That's a good place to target. Let's think about the iron and manganese, very critical. A lot of these fertilizers don't have enough of the micronutrients in there, so we may need to supplement or separate those nutrients out, so we can apply them in more volume. And then, hey, boron, a very big consideration. High moisture situation, high humidity situations limits our boron uptake, so be sure there's ample boron in there. And then a monitoring program. We're talking about monitoring for pest, disease, and nutrition. So keep it on target. That's the way to be successful. Let's prevent those problems before they pop up.
So that is a quick overview of what is all it takes to be successful with the product. And some thoughts that you have. I'm sure that this is one of those things, Bill, that they probably are going to want to definitely go back and review. But it just kind of covers a wide range of topics that are important if they want to have a successful vegetative season.
It made a lot of sense. You guys are flying. I know there was a lot of good information. It will be archived and saved as a video for anybody who wants to go back and slow it down and pause it and take some notes. We did have a couple questions. You guys want to take, we got 2. So
all right, let's go for it.
First question that came in is, what temperature are you shooting for on the cuttings? So what is that ideal temperature when you look at those cuttings that just came in?
When you're looking at it in a cooler that you only have, you got a choice of one, usually about 50 degrees in the cooler is an ideal temperature. And the reason is that you've got a bunch of products that chill, things like New Guineas, Ipomea. These all are Angelonia, really don't like to be down in that 40 degrees with that Calibrachoa and Petunia love to be. What our experience has been is it's not so much temperature, guys, it's the humidity that kills you. It's the drying them out. And so you really want to make sure that you've got plenty of humidity. If you think about the value in that cooler, a $5,000 humidity unit probably is a pretty cheap investment when you think about the lost revenue. So really go in and look at it. If you've got just a small amount of production, just a regular humidifier, something is better than nothing. Wetting the floors is nothing, but put something. Once you then move them out into your sticking area and holding area, you're going to have to keep the people happy. So there you can run a little bit warmer. But again, the humidity is important. Have a curtain of humidity around the perimeter so that you don't end up with a dry area. And then it goes into the recommendations that are out in the industry as far as for rooting. There's a number of different very good guides on what temperatures you should be using.
Okay.
Will, clarify for me, when you were suggesting using the infrared thermometer when the URC arrived, what temperature were you looking for there? Is that again in that 50-degree range?
That's what the question was. Yeah, you basically, you're looking for the cuttings to be somewhere above 35 degrees Fahrenheit. So you don't want them freezing. A lot of them, if you're at the 40, you're fine. 45, you're good. 50, you're okay. 55, you're okay. 60, it's now starting to get to be concerning. If you're starting to go 70, 80 and above, you got problems, kids. Usually you're going to see wilting as soon as you start getting above 70. So there won't be turgid. There'll be those limp birds, the dead bird look. So basically that's how you can double check your temperatures. Because remember, plants remember where they've been. So the temperature might be right, but if they're looking like a dead bird, they weren't right.
Gotcha. And next one, I think this one goes to you, Todd. You talked about the rooting hormone, that K-IBA. Yeah. Are there any brands or any products out there that you've seen proven effective? Anything you want to recommend?
Well, I'm most familiar with the Hortus brand of K-IBA. That's been the one that's most common out there. I will say I just saw, not too long ago that I think it's Fine Chemicals has some new rooting hormone products coming out. I haven't tried those personally yet. I'll be doing that soon, as soon as I get some time and can get back in the greenhouse. But yeah, Hortus is the one that I've gotten the K-IBA, the soluble form from in the past.
Okay, great. And that actually, that wraps up the questions that came in through the Q&A and through the chat, which thank you guys for covering those. And also, thank you so much for kicking off this series, this In the Break Room series. I know that propagating your vegetative crops is certainly an important topic. I'm sure that everybody viewing feels a lot more confident with their spring production already and training their teams on a lot of what you guys shared. Really, really appreciate it. Just again, I want to share a little bit of housekeeping here is that this series will be archived and collected at growertalks.com/tech-on-demand. And we are going to be coming back next week and throughout the month with additional topics. So we're going to, Will mention the fish grow in water, roots grow in air a couple times, and the water by weight. So we will have a fantastic video presentation. It's not going to be live. It'll be a recorded video that you can view at your leisure. And that will be available next Tuesday. And then following that on Thursday is going to be a discussion on photoperiod for key crops. So again, gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us today. On behalf of Will and Todd, I'm Bill Calkins with Ball Tech on Demand, wishing you a fantastic spring season and fall season as we wrap up the year.